Welcome to Season 5 of the Manufacturers Network. Real talk with the people building what's next in manufacturing. And now your host, Lisa Ryan.
Hey, it's Lisa Ryan. Welcome to the Manufacturers Network podcast. Excited to introduce our guest today, Paul Sippil. Paul is a forensic 401k consultant who has spent 17 years analyzing public retirement plan filings and has documented over 1,300 cases of apparent excessive fees. He makes the case that most American employers, including manufacturers, have never seen the true cost of their 401k plan and that the structure of the market is designed to keep it that way. Paul, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
So share with us a little bit about your background and what led you to doing what you do.
Sure. I often describe myself as a recovering CPA, non-practicing, and no offense to CPAs out there. And I knew my very first day, my first job as an auditor, it just didn't feel right. And I'm not that intuitive, but in that case, I was. And I really didn't know what to do with my career until a few years later when I became a financial advisor dealing with estate and succession planning issues for business owners, which was interesting and valuable. But what was more interesting to me was the ability to look up 401k plan tax forms online, which I learned about 20 years ago from a conversation I had with a colleague who explained to me this information was all public. So I just couldn't believe that I could actually just go online and find companies' retirement plan tax forms. So what I did was I started calling these business owners, especially ones where I was able to see service charges that I thought were particularly high, and let them know about what I was seeing, thinking I'd be a hero. But their responses really surprised me, which were mainly, I'm not paying anything. And, oh, no, I don't have to worry about that because my friend handles that. And when I would get responses like that, when I saw that there was such a great disconnect between what they believed and reality, I realized I could make a whole career just consulting in this one area and decided to call myself a forensic 401k consultant and a 401k vigilante, as I say on my LinkedIn profile.
Okay. So what are it sounds like the whole my friend's doing it type of thing is one of the misunderstandings, but what are some of the most common misunderstandings that employers have about how their 401k plan actually works?
The main one, because there's no invoice, and this is something I've been in communication with the Department of Labor about to get their guidance changed, is that nobody's ever seen a bill. So the big misunderstanding is that somehow the participants are not bearing the cost. It's actually the mutual funds that are paying everything, but the company in reality doesn't pay for it. That's true. But I don't know if everyone, and a lot of people I've talked to, not necessarily manufacturers misunderstanding more than anyone else, but a lot of people truly believe or don't believe that the participants are actually bearing any of the costs. So I would say, above all else, that's the biggest misunderstanding.
So I guess I'm not really understanding the whole thing about they're not getting a bill and they're seeing it. So I'm an employee and I put $100 into my 401k and my employer matches, let's say $20 of that.
Sure.
What happens from there? Like, where are these fees coming in and where's the money going?
Yeah. And depending on how egregious the fees are, a significant percentage of that $20 is going to get wiped out. And when I say by fees, financial advisory fees, regardless of whether or not the financial advisor is even providing any services, which is the big thing, it's okay to charge a significant fee, again, if the fee is in return for actual services provided that are commensurate with that fee. There are also mutual fund fees, which you can't avoid and are often very low if you choose what's known as index funds or passively managed funds. And in addition to that, there are also fees known as record keeping and administration fees. And sometimes there's a fee called a custodial fee. Examples of custodians are like Charles Schwab, for example. Examples of record keepers are Principal, Voya, Securian, John Hancock. Those are some of the bigger providers out there. The payroll companies like Paychex and ADP as well. And then financial advisory fees, it could be someone who's acting as a broker where they're receiving what's known as commissions that are built into the cost of the mutual fund that's embedded within the management fee. Or there are what's known as registered investment advisors that don't get paid from the funds, but often charge a percentage of the asset value that's separate from those funds. So to answer your question, those fees will come either indirectly through the cost of the funds or directly out of the participants' accounts. And because they're based, I think, wrongfully on a percentage of the total account value, even though the percentage often does decrease at some point, as the account value goes up, meaning as you put more money in, those service charges actually increase without any increase in services being provided. I hope that wasn't too convoluted and long-winded.
Yeah, it just sounds like I'm not going to end up with any money out of all the money I'm putting in. If manufacturers are assuming that they would see these major costs of a plan on an invoice, and you started saying that, but where are the fees actually showing up inside of a typical plan structure? How would I know all the people that were getting a piece of that?
It's very difficult to find out. Now, in 2012, there was major legislation, fee disclosure legislation that was passed known as 408B2 and 404A5, which basically refers to employer disclosures at the total cost level and at the participant level. So if you look closely as a participant at your statements, you're going to see some service charges. They may not be labeled clearly. They might only be labeled as a percentage instead of a dollar amount. And even if they are labeled clearly and shown in actual dollars, which is, I think, a more honest and open way to disclose something, there's no context. And this is where I differentiate between price transparency, which I think people know what that means. It just means you see everything, and price literacy. Even if you see all the fees, how do you know enough, like you would shop for a cell phone or a car, which you would know if a fee is reasonable because you could easily look at other providers. Let's say you see a charge of $100 for a record-keeping service. How do you know if that $100 shouldn't be $20? You wouldn't know that. Now, as an employer, same thing. If you're really not familiar with the total cost in dollars, not at the participant level, but when you add up all the participants' cost, what are you buying? How do you know that the fee disclosed is even reasonable? How do you even know that there isn't a comparable service provider in terms of service level and technology that's not out there who's charging a much lower price? So that's what I try to explain is who are the other providers out there? There's one pretty good national provider called Ascensus, ASCENSUS. I'm not promoting because I have no financial relationship with them. It's just they're a low-cost, pretty decent service provider that charges an explicit dollar fee, and they openly share what that fee is. And I believe they do send an actual invoice to reflect the fees coming out of the participants' accounts. So the plan sponsor, being the CFO, the business owner, or the HR person, can actually see what the participants collectively are being billed.
So if a manufacturer hasn't reviewed their plan in several years, what are the kind of risks or the blind spots that they may be facing besides realizing that there's a lower cost provider out there?
Very good question. Yes, that's one thing, lower cost providers out there for comparable services, because not all service levels are the same. And sometimes you could say you get what you pay for, and a more costly provider might have better service, but it doesn't always work that way in the retirement plan industry. And yet another blind spot, I'll give two of them. One is you can negotiate the record keeping fees, whether it's John Hancock or Principal or Voya or Fidelity or one of the other big providers. In many cases, because they're getting paid on a percentage of assets basis, meaning based on how much money is in the plan, they don't always automatically decrease the percentage. Now, the total dollars will still go up, but in most cases, and I've done this for people, even people who aren't my clients, I just tell them, did you ever think to negotiate the fees? And what I mean by negotiating is literally just asking. You don't have to have any financial sophistication whatsoever. If you're getting charged 0.5% and they reduce it to 0.4% and it's a $3 million plan, 0.1% of a difference is $3,000. That's a lot of money collectively to save per participants. Let's say there's only 10 people. That's $300 a person just from making a phone call. And that's forever. It doesn't just go down temporarily now. Your new fee is 0.4%. So that's one blind spot. Another blind spot is that you can A, negotiate the advisory fee too, and B, you don't even have to have an advisor. You can eliminate the advisor completely. And in many cases, they're not even using an advisor. And in one case, this is the craziest example. From 2019 to 2024, there was one company with just 3 people from the tax forums I could see had paid out over $49,000 in commissions to a broker who they didn't even know they had. They didn't even know they were working with this person. So they clearly didn't provide any services. But it gets worse because the HR director then called the administrator of the plan just to find out who the broker was. Because if I paid out that much money, I would at least want to know who that person was. Yeah. But turns out that upon Googling the broker's name, apparently this broker had actually been dead since 2014.
Wow.
And someone publicly on a social media post, an administrator himself, pushed back at me and said, Paul, everybody's got to get paid. When I was talking about advisors being overpaid, everybody's got to make a living, he said. And what I responded is, you first have to be living.
Exactly.
And he couldn't, the mindset of defending the status quo is so detached from reality that he couldn't even wrap his mind around the idea that a dead person could be getting paid for over a decade. And of course, then you can eliminate the advisor. And what was happening is that the advisor's firm was probably getting paid, and the firm, knowing that they didn't send an invoice, knowing that they could get away with getting all this money, didn't even want the client to know that they existed, because the mere alerting the client that they were even there could potentially tip the client off to the fact they could either eliminate or negotiate their fees. But if they didn't even know they existed, then they knew they couldn't get fired.
Wow.
And they wouldn't have to do, or maybe the client wouldn't want to fire them, but he'd want them to do some actual work. So it's actually an industry that's incentivized, or where the advisors are incentivized to literally do nothing and hope that they forget that they even exist, because then you can't get fired.
Wow. So you started saying this about the competitive marketplace. This is an industry that's been around for decades, but it's obviously not operating like a competitive marketplace because of it really sounds like all that, the secrecy. So what does that mean in practical terms? Is this something that we can actually do something about, or do we just have to throw up our hands and say, hey, that's what it is?
Most people can't because they're too busy and aren't listening to the show. Or maybe most people are. If they are, that's great, because then you can do something about it. Very simple. You can search for a lower cost provider. Employee fiduciary is another one. Again, I have no financial relationship with them whatsoever. Those are 2 good examples of flat fee-based, lower cost providers whose service is really not necessarily any worse than the providers who charge a lot more money. Their websites aren't as fancy, but if people aren't even using the website much anyway, it may not matter. And as I mentioned, you can always negotiate. You can eliminate the advisor. You can demand invoices. You can demand the advisor charges a fixed flat dollar fee. It's usually billed quarterly. That's commensurate with the actual level of services they are providing. And if everybody knew they could do this, the industry would change overnight. This is why I'm working with the Department of Labor to get them to alter their fiduciary guidance, not a mandate, because I don't really like burdening people with additional compliance cost, just suggesting, and usually when businesses get guidance from the government, they don't just ignore it, that providers actually start invoicing their clients. What's happening now is there's a fee disclosure sheet that you can find, but A, people don't know it exists. B, it's completely removed from the experience of the fees. When you're getting a regular invoice, you're experiencing the feeling and the pain of that fee in real time. Even though it may not be at the employer level, you're still experiencing that fee. But if there's an annual fee disclosure document that has no connection to the experience of the cost, and you have to go find it and you have to do work to actually interpret it, it's not creating that cost sensitivity that would have otherwise been created through an invoice. And the invoices might stimulate questions like, do I get a tax deduction for these fees as participants? The answer is no, you don't. Who pays the majority of those fees? What's the people with the biggest balances? Who's that? It's the business owner. So if you own a manufacturing company, let's say 70% of the balance in the plan is your money, not only are you paying with non-tax deductible dollars, but that account is a tax advantaged, tax-free, or tax deferred account that you want as much money as possible staying inside of. You don't want fees coming out of an account that's already tax advantaged. And if you were to pay at the employer level, not only would you pay much less because you would suddenly become way more sensitive to the cost, but you'd get a tax deduction like you would any other business expense. So to me, and by the way, from a workplace culture standpoint, it would improve the culture so much because you'd be saving participants hundreds of thousands of dollars over their investment lifetime. In fact, the Department of Labor did a case study for, I believe, a participant starting with a $25,000 balance who's 35 years old, and showed that over 30 years, simply paying an extra 1% in fees would cost that participant about $64,000 and equivalent to about 28% of their balance. And if you have more money in the plan, it's going to cost even more. So that's why it's so useful to be aware of just what your rights are and what you can do.
So if you have, and I'm trying to process this in my brain, so let's just say for giggles, you had $1 million in a 401k and all of these services, all of these fees are coming out of it, but basically because they have access to that $1 million, they're just taking it out and they're not necessarily letting you know the fees that are out. But if they sent you an invoice that, hey, we are taking, here's the statement of the fees that we have taken out of your account, or are you saying to leave the $1 million in there, send me an invoice, and then I'll pay a separate check for the fees? Like, how is that?
I'm actually saying it could be either one. And that's another big thing, because employers don't even know they have the option to pay the fees. It would bet. Now, if the owner only has 10% of the balance and the money is spread out throughout a bunch of key employees, yeah, the owner could still pay the fee, but it's not the end of the world if the owner decides to pass the fees on collectively to the participants. Now, if you're actually writing a check at the employer level, like it's implied and assumed you're going to get an invoice. And by the way, ideally, you don't just want to get the invoice with the dollar amount. You should have a listing of what services are provided on invoice, just like you would have with any other consulting arrangement, right? If you are paying your accountant, you're going to know like what the accountant did. It was to prepare your tax return, and maybe the accountant did some additional tax research, or your attorney and you get a big legal bill. You better believe that a lot of manufacturing company owners are going to question their attorney if they sent a bill that was bigger than what they expected, and they want an accounting of the services that are provided. So yes, that's one clear option, is just send me an invoice, have $0 coming out of that $1 million. The other option is, yes, they're telling you they're taking the money out technically through the fee disclosure document that isn't really connected to the fees in real time. So they're technically telling you, but they're not telling you in a way that's as clear as it could be. And they're not even always telling you in dollars. And since nobody else is doing that, it's preventing people from making comparisons the way they would make comparisons when you shop for a car. Like when I buy a car, I always buy Toyota Camrys. I know how to look for the Carfax report. I know how the amount of miles and the condition of the car and the year that it was made is all going to affect the price. And then I can compare cars of similar condition. So if one with all the criteria being similar is a lot more than the other, then I know one of those cars is mispriced. And I'm going to buy the less expensive one, everything else being equal. There's not enough information flowing in the 401k plan industry in terms of the technology, the cost, and the services that these providers offer, and namely the financial advisor too, in order for employers who are making the purchasing decision, but the people paying for it aren't the ones who are oftentimes in charge. Because if the HR or the CFO is in charge and they only have 10% of the balance, that means people accounting for 90% had no say-so in the decision. So I've argued with the government that they asked me, what do you think, Paul? Because I actually had a call with the Department of Labor. What do you think of the participant fee disclosure? And I said, I don't think anything of the participant fee disclosure. They're not the buyers. So I don't care what you disclose to the participants. They don't have any say-so over what happens. So if you get a bill to reflect the participant cost in actual dollars with a description of the services, then you can be in a position to negotiate the fees. And as Milton Friedman, the economist, once said, there's 4 ways to spend money. You can spend your own money on yourself, your own money on someone else's money on yourself, or someone else's money on someone else. The first one is the best because you care about cost and quality. The last is the worst because you don't care about cost and quality. And I think that's the problem.
So when companies do take a closer look at their plan and decide to make changes, what does that process usually involve?
What it usually involves is what someone might call an RFP, request for a proposal, and they might look at a few other providers. And that's actually a really good question because I think this process demonstrates why the industry never changes. And I see oftentimes they change from one expensive provider to another. And then I've seen other cases where they did the reverse, where they changed from the other provider back to the original one. So like, whether it's like Fidelity, Voya, Hancock, I mean, they're all pretty similar. One might go from one to the other, and then another one might do the reverse, and they all think they saved money somehow. But what often happens is they might choose funds that have lower expense ratios. So the fund cost might be less, which is a whole other discussion, but the service charges are no different. And oftentimes the advisor gets a big upfront fee as an inducement to move to the new provider. And that fee is buried within the total cost. Now, that could be an ethical arrangement. Not only does the advisor disclose and explain that fee in English, but then reduces their compensation that they would have otherwise charged in addition because they're already getting paid by the record keeper. And what that does when the record keeper has to pay out a big fee to the advisor, the record keeper then has to charge a higher ongoing fee to the participants to recoup the fee that they paid out to the advisor. That gets a little confusing, and I find that the direct billing arrangement, fixed dollar fees, is with fixed dollar fees, or just a fixed dollar fee arrangement which billed to the participants is so much simpler and better.
So advisors and consultants are often playing a role in helping employers manage their retirement plans. What specific questions should manufacturers ask to understand how their advisor is compensated?
Yeah, literally just how do you get paid and how much? Tell me how much money you're charging me, just in dollars. Give it to me in plain English. Don't say we get paid by the fund company and we're getting a management fee. And I want to explain that too, because the management fees are fake. And when I say fake, I mean that the accounts are actually participant directed. If you've ever had a 401k plan, you know that you often get a list of 20, 30 choices, and you can pick whatever funds you want. The advisor may have helped select those funds, but the advisor's not making any buy-sell decisions for you and is not controlling what you do within those 20 or 30 choices. So then by definition, the advisor's not actually managing anything. They're just waiting for the participants to call. So not only how do you get paid, but if they have been getting paid, how much have you made off of our accounts in dollars every year, let's say for the last 3 years? And then how many hours have you spent servicing our account? How many people have you talked to? Who have you talked to? What did you talk about? And how long did you talk? You wouldn't have to have those conversations if it was just listed on the invoice, just like an attorney would say X amount of hours for X amount of services. This would all go away. And nobody would be willing to pay $40,000, $50,000 a year in brokerage commissions. I have a whole list of those plans. Like you made a mention, over 1,300 of those plans that are paying egregious fees that I can see from the tax forms that no matter how much work you're doing, there's no way that anyone would write a check to an advisor for $50,000 a year when there's only 10 people. And if they ever got a bill for that much, the first thing they would ask is, who did you talk to? And how long did you talk? Because you're asking for 50 grand. Why don't I ask my people who called you and let's hash this out before I write you that check?
As we're starting to get to the end of our time together today, for a business owner or plant leader listening today, what is one practical step they could take to better understand the structure of their own 401k plan?
Just first of all, find out the name of every provider who's involved with their plan, because believe it or not, everyone remembers or knows off the top of their head. And don't stop asking how much money they've made in dollars until you get an answer, because sometimes they'll point you to a fee disclosure document called 408B2 that won't actually tell the fees in dollars and won't make it very clear. I want to know, how much did I pay the record keeper in dollars every year for at least the last 3 years? And ask the same question to the administrator and to the advisor. And if there is a custodian, ask the same question to that party.
Wow, that sounds like they could save quite a bit of money. So if somebody did want to continue the conversation and learn more and just ask some additional questions, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Really easy. There's a lot of content on my website, paulsippil.com. That's PaulSippil.com. 2 P's as in Paul. And my email and phone number right on there. My email is just my first initial, last name, psippil@paulsippil.com.
All right. Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure, and I learned a lot, so I appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
I'm Lisa Ryan, and this is the Manufacturers Network Podcast. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Manufacturers Network Podcast. If this conversation gave you something to think about, share it with someone else who will get it. And hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next.